Welcome to the Healer Series, where I interview different healers and teachers who share their expertise, their thoughts on healing, and some of their favorite techniques to help you heal. All right, welcome everyone. Today I have with me Sara B. Taylor. She is a trained neuroscientist, a former psychology professor, and a mother. She has worked through her own complex developmental trauma and guides women to do the same. She helps women with a history of early childhood stress to end the patterns of dysfunction and emotional trauma that have passed down to them. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So Sara, let's just go into a little bit more detail about your background as a neuroscientist, as a psychology professor, and your journey into coaching women now.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of a long journey. So I am a trained neuroscientist. I have my expertise is in the effects of stress as a risk factor to various mental illnesses. And I spent the majority of my research career doing preclinical research. So I was doing this in animal models and using drugs to look at the effects of stress on genes and how that interacts with stress. So doing this sort of genetic vulnerability on top of adding stress either prenatally or in adolescence or in adulthood, and then what the behavioral effects of that are, as well as how that impacts the brain. And some of my work in the brain was looking at structural neuroplasticity. And so I did that research focused career for a while, and then I shifted into a more teaching career when I became a professor in psychology. And I got to teach about my favorite things, the effects of drugs and hormones on behavior and the brain, as well as research methods and, intro psych. So I did that for about 6 years. And then I was doing research while I was doing that, and I shifted to more mindfulness kind of research in humans as opposed to preclinical research. And I just realized that this career felt so constricting, and it wasn't allowing me to do what I wanted. My favorite part was connecting with my students, particularly my female students who had lives that were similar to mine. And so I was spending hours mentoring them and, getting them what they needed and, dealing with some pretty big stuff on top of teaching and research. And I realized this is what I love. So at some point, just before going up for tenure, I instead gave 14 months notice, which I don't recommend. That's a long goodbye. And then my last teaching year was in the middle of coronavirus, where we all went online. So yeah, so it was a fun throwing into the fire of leaving that career. So my coaching work had been sort of my side hustle. I wasn't hustling too hard, but a side hustle. And so now it's my full-time work.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I find it fascinating, neuroscience and the effect of, trauma and all of it. So just explain to us, what is developmental trauma? What does that mean? And how does it affect us and our development?
Absolutely. So I'll first step back to what is trauma, if that's okay, just because it's a hard thing to define. And so even the leaders in the field, getting them to nail down a definition in a book or in a talk is really tough. So when I talk about trauma, I start with stress, because trauma is the effect of stress. And so stress is just any kind of experience that it leads you to have a real or perceived threat to your safety, your life, or your sense of belonging. And so traumatic stress is just stress where you don't get out of the response. You kind of get stuck. So it's usually something that's really overwhelming, or a lot of people say it's too much, too soon, or too fast. But with developmental trauma, it's not always too much, too soon, or too fast. It can be this sort of low level of things are just, your needs are not getting met. And usually that's going to be something like your attachment needs to your caregiver, which can start prenatally and very early on, or it can be emotional neglect or parentification, where the kids end up taking care of the parents because of stuff that's going on with them. And so developmental trauma is really, it really has to do with the age at which people are getting stuck in their sort of survival responses. The stress response is a survival response. It's designed to help you get through whatever is happening without as much harm as possible. And so developmental trauma is, some people call it from 0 to 3. Like there's critical periods, like 0 to 3 is a really critical period for brain development, but then 0 to 7 is a whole nother period. And some people say developmental trauma is anything up until 18 years old. And so then you're sort of transitioning into adulthood. And so it can affect you in so many ways. And so many things can be traumatic, but they aren't automatically, right? So if you've experienced something like a caregiver that was not able to attend to your emotional needs as a child, if that didn't last for a really long time and you had other support, that may not be traumatic. But if your primary caregiver just shut down and was no longer able to like acknowledge your needs or meet them, and you didn't feel connected to them, then that can be traumatic. So it's tricky, because at some point you can be like, well, everything is traumatic. So I don't want to give that impression. But the effects of developmental trauma can really go into belief systems, like repressed, that's such a sort of a hot button word, but like repressed emotions or suppressed emotions. So emotions that are not felt. It can also lead to relational issues where it's difficult to connect with other people in healthy ways. And so really it just becomes these like behavioral patterns that get set in stone, because the brain is still developing, and the brain is developing in these conditions that say it's not safe, or it's not safe for me to do this, or for me to be myself. And so you kind of get smaller, and that getting smaller is often going to be one of a few survival responses. And then that survival response is something that you just kind of go to over and over again. And it's usually not very good for your physical or mental well-being. So you kind of get stuck. So it just becomes almost like a habit that was so helpful when we were young, but then in adulthood, it's really become kind of maladaptive. And so many people are not dealing with this until they're older and like in a little bit more of a stable position. They're like, oh, I might have had some trauma, and I think I'm done with this pattern of responding to the world because it doesn't serve me anymore.
And we can look at, because like a lot of people, when they think of trauma, they're thinking of like someone was abused or whatever else. Can it be something a lot smaller where it's like, oh, no, I never had that trauma, but we still have these patterns in adulthood that are not the healthiest?
Absolutely. So yeah. So, and that's the kind of trauma that I work with. So I don't work with people who have had, like, we know there's obvious ones, like, you know, being in a car accident or a natural disaster, like living in a war zone, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, living in an environment that is violent. All of those are kind of like, yes, obvious trauma. But there are other smaller traumas that sometimes they're called small t or little t traumas, but they can also just be called developmental or relational. I like to use the word invisible because they're not things that, like, when we experience them, we're like, oh yeah, that was traumatic, where it's a consistent disconnection. So it could be, an example that I like to use is like having a parent who has an untreated mental illness. They may have erratic or unpredictable outbursts, maybe angry outbursts that are scary. And it goes on and on and on. And it leads to this underlying sense of not being safe, even if the thought is not there. And in kids, especially early on, are internalizing all of this. Like if something bad is happening out here, they cannot separate what is outside of them from themselves. And so it becomes, I'm bad, or I am the one who's causing this. And so if somebody has an untreated mental illness and maybe is not had, you know, when they grew up, their parents were not on to all of this, they probably weren't teaching them how to deal with this, then the kid is just going to internalize all of that. And it becomes these really deep-seated belief systems, and which become someone's identity, where it's like, I'm not good enough. I'm too much. I'm not allowed to feel. It's not safe for me to feel my emotions, right? And so it can often be boundary violations. So it could be that's kind of more intense, but like, so that would be like physical abuse, but it could just be like consistently having like an intrusive person, like, constantly touching you and not respecting when you say no. And that is that trauma. I don't know, that could lead to some patterns, but when it's chronic and it's on top of an unstable home where your needs are not getting met, where you have uninvolved parents who are not connecting with you, letting you know that you are important, that you matter, who are not in sync with you, the word's attuned. So you want to have parents who are see your needs and then meet them and allow you to express yourself without stomping it down, which is a challenge as a parent, right? That's been the hardest thing for me is to do this as a parent, knowing all of this.
Yeah, because I think the interesting thing is, like, for me, I know, like, we've all had a certain amount of, like, trauma, whether small t trauma or whatever else, because, I have excellent parents. They're great, but my brother was severely mentally disabled. So that created a whole dynamic of, like, oh, they're busy with him or whatever else, or I better not ask for those things. And I think it can be tricky for people to recognize that, oh, there may be some things that were created, even though you love your parents, they're wonderful people, they did the best that they could in a difficult situation, having a mentally disabled child. I grew up on a farm, so they're busy with that, and they had jobs. But that there still can be stuff that's created, even though it may not have been parents who meant to or wanted to or whatever. You know what I mean by that?
I do. And I always come from this place. So it's tricky. And when I work with people, it's like, I want to honor that they didn't get their needs met and also not go to this blaming place, because truly, in most cases, our parents, in this case of this invisible, early, maybe relational trauma, that's more small t, our parents were doing the best that they could, and they had difficult situations and they had their own stuff. And that's where it becomes this sort of what gets passed down is like, they had their own stuff. Their needs weren't met. They didn't know how to do this. Their models for parenting, their models of how to be in relationship with people were all screwed up too. And so I feel like this generation of people that, there's multiple generations that are doing this work now that are trying to break these patterns. And it is hard work. Like, it requires that you bring some like warrior energy to it, because it can be wearing on you, and it's good to have support for sure. But yeah, I always go back to everybody's doing the best they can, because I have to, for me too, because I'm not being perfect, right? And for a while I was like, I have to be perfect because I know all this, and that was not sustainable.
Yeah,
Not even
goes,
close.
oh wait, perfection, that's a waste of time, and nobody achieves that.
Right, exactly. It's hard though. It's having a kid and trying to break these patterns. It's a big responsibility, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
And that's an interesting thing, that it wasn't until a couple of years ago I sort of realized intergenerational trauma. And I think a lot of communities and families deal with that sort of passing down of things and trauma that they have. Talk a little bit more about that for us, because I think a lot of people are just starting to get onto that. And even, trauma, because I think you mentioned some of the trauma even in utero.
Yeah. And that was my first foray into neuroscience research, was prenatal stress, what was happening, right? And so I kind of put all of that in there. That's why I like the category of invisible trauma, because at some level it doesn't matter what the label is, but like, it is coming from other places. And so the way that trauma can get passed down can be via behavioral or emotional patterns, but it can also be epigenetically, where we have modifications to our genes that allow them to be expressed or not expressed. And our early life experiences are particularly powerful modulators of how genes get expressed later on in life. And so that can get passed down. There's these wonderful studies in mice that were exposed. So like, one generation was exposed to a cherry scent while they were being shocked. I think that's a common stressor. So it's a pretty intense, like, you would call that a trauma for a mouse. it's not causing tissue damage, but it's like, whoa. So they were pairing the scent of cherry with being shocked. And then they bred the mice, and 3 generations down, those offspring, if you expose them to the cherry scent, they've never been shocked ever. They still had a freeze response. And so this has been found, so that was one of the early studies where it's like, oh, and so they have this memory. This is what fascinates me, is that they have this memory, this sensory memory. They don't have a memory of being shocked. That doesn't make sense to them, but they still react as though it's a threat, even though it's not. And so when you think about all of the stuff that has happened to, like, in our lineages or with our ancestors, right? And if you're talking about, so like lots of things have happened, but if you go far enough back, like there's been a lot of carnage, right? Especially for non-white folks, because and that's even more recent, right? And so there's this whole level of stuff that's being inherited that doesn't necessarily make sense, but is going to impact how you live your life. And so even with parents, so like, let's say a mom, when she was a baby, she was not allowed to cry, and she was spanked for crying as an infant or something, something like that. And then, so she grows up thinking that expression of emotion, particularly sadness or getting her needs met, is not okay. And then she has a child who cries, an infant, and that triggers this old memory of how she was in danger for crying. And so she gets triggered and gets put into maybe a shutdown state where she is not able to respond emotionally. Then this next generation is not going to get their needs met in a different way. And so it cycles. It's not the same thing per generation. It kind of goes through these patterns. And so it's really good to know a little bit about like what your life was as a kid, or what your parents' lives were, your biological parents, if you can get that information. But it's also not necessary, because our bodies have it, just like with those mice responding to the smell of cherry. Like, no one needed to tell them that their ancestors were shocked when they were exposed to cherry, but they still have it. So the body really does have all of this information for us. So we don't have to have a story, which is frustrating for a lot of people. But sometimes it's a gift to not have a story too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's so important to know with healing, because, I think, and even when you talk about with non-white folks who dealt with a lot more trauma, I think it's also good for people to know that. So when you're dealing with other communities or talking about it, you're recognizing that that's so much to deal with. And I really agree with you that you need that warrior energy within you, because it takes a lot. Because even for me, when I looked at certain patterns back, and especially as women, sometimes, the added trauma of stuff with that it does take that strong energy to be like, I have to be able to look at that and not just to sort of keep that pattern. Because sometimes it's a lot easier to keep a pattern instead of trying to like work on it.
Totally. It still sucks, but it's like, you got to get over the inertia, like, to make the change. Like, that's why so many of us need support to do that, right? Like, it's so hard to do on your own, but not only to see it, but to get over it, to know that you're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. This all makes sense, right? Yeah.
So how does the stress of stuff like that affect our nervous system and our health?
That's a big question.
It's a big question. It's a big question.
I have some book recommendations too, especially, I'm just gonna put this up because I'm gonna forget it, and it's backwards, but Gabor Mate, he has a book called When the Body Says No that explores the stress and disease connection. I highly recommend that. So he's a medical doctor, and he's done a lot of work with like addiction as a coping mechanism to early life repressed emotions. So that's if somebody wants to go real deep with that, that's a great book. But that is a big question. So stress activates two systems. And so those systems are a hormonal system that results in the increase of like this hormone cortisol, which comes from the adrenal glands, but it also activates the autonomic nervous system, particularly the sympathetic nervous system, which most of us might have learned as the fight or flight response, maybe in biology or physio. I don't know. I don't know what classes people take anymore. I've taught this for so long that I forget what folks know. But it's like the activation. So if you're nervous and you're like shaking a little bit or sweating or your stomach is kind of swirling, you've got butterflies in your stomach, that's the sort of fight or flight response. It's helping you to respond. But there's also this other side of the stress response where if that fight or flight energy can't get you out of the situation, it flips to shutdown, to a shutdown response, which is also part of the autonomic nervous system. It's just the parasympathetic branch. And that's when like you just can't respond. And that's where most things get kind of stuck as trauma, is you go into this either freeze, which is kind of both sympathetic and parasympathetic together. It's kind of like having your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time, which is just not good. And it's especially not good to be there for a long period of time. And then the shutdown comes after that. And that's where there's just like conservation of energy, where you're just kind of trying to get through. And that comes with sort of the emotional state of overwhelm, or it can also lead to dissociation, right? And so these can lead to these survival patterns. So you can, as you are experiencing stress as a kid, like your survival pattern could be to go and respond with rage, right? Like I'm gonna, like a toddler tantrum that never goes away. Like that could be your survival. So, and that can have effects. So there's plenty of studies on the effects of like uncontrolled anger and rage, and like how that affects cardiovascular health, right? But also with the shutdown, if your response is just to shut down and maybe dissociate, you're just in this constant state of conservation. And so that's really your nervous system, and that can lead and drive your behavioral responses. The cortisol piece, the hormone piece, is really involved in the physical and like even more medical kind of consequences of trauma. I think they both are, but more research has been done on the effect of cortisol on organ systems and that kind of effect. And it can do long-term suppression of the immune system, and it can lead to changes in basically every organ system, because almost every cell, I hesitate to ever say every, but almost every cell in your body has a receptor to catch those little molecules of cortisol and then be changed by them. So your body is always responding to all of this activation, and it's really energy levels and the hormone levels that are coming with that. And so when you grow up experiencing constant either fight energy or shutdown energy and high levels of cortisol, it changes your physiology, it changes how your brain is developing, and it just becomes this sort of long-term chronic stress. So that even if you don't feel like you're under chronic stress right now, your system is acting as though it is, because that was how it learned. And so that can really cause a lot of problematic kinds of health issues, either physical or mental. And really, I don't think there's really a lot of difference between them. I think, right, I like to work with the body mind, where it's all working together, right? Does that answer your question?
It totally does. Because I think, because I help women improve their self-care with autoimmune illness. And I know for me, if I'm under stress, because there's sometimes where it's like, I'm eating pretty well, I'm not doing too bad, but I'm getting a flare up. And it's like, oh, I've been experiencing stress. And I think sometimes we forget that even if it's not within our immediate, like, because I have a wonderful husband, I'm very privileged, economically, where I live, the home that I live in. But there's still a certain time where there's a lot of the outside chaos that sometimes, it's like, oh, I am stressed about something, or there is this little thing, or something's coming up from my past that I haven't really dealt with, even though it doesn't seem like a lot in my mind. And I think that's something that we forget, is even though we may not feel like we're in stress, that sometimes it's because I'm not doing the check-in. I'm not being quiet and kind of like listening to what's going on. I'm just busy doing all my stuff.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I have this, I think being busy is a way of avoiding like that, like it's a coping mechanism. Like that was my coping mechanism. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I can't deal with this. All this stuff in my 20s. I was like, yeah, I think I'm just gonna like run to the arms of academia where I'm gonna work 80-hour weeks and like I'm just never gonna stop. And like, and I'll just be great until until I like get pregnant and have to start burning out because I'm like, it's just too much, right?
Yeah.
And you think that like it's yeah. But you're right. So many of us, we have this idea of what stress is and how it feels, and it, you know, and maybe that's like how you feel right before you're going to give like a public presentation or something. You're like, well, that's stress, I don't feel that. But there, it can be so much bigger. And yeah, it does require the like checking in, and often it's like the symptoms that your body is giving you are signals. They're not just something to get rid of. I mean, yeah, we don't want to have these symptoms, but it's a clue. Like I always say, stress is shining a flashlight on what needs to be healed or what you need to address. And sometimes that's difficult because we just want to like, oh, you know, westernized culture away is like just slap a band-aid on it and it'll be fine, and just so I don't see it, it's okay. But really kind of attending to what is my body telling me with these symptoms, right? Like my digestion is all screwed up right now. What does that mean? Does that mean I should take more antacids, or does that mean that I should maybe breathe a little before I eat my meals so that my body is not in some stress mode while I'm eating?
Yeah, exactly. I love what you say about sometimes we need help with that because it's slowing down and checking in. But I know I found some times where I can sometimes feel a little anxious before a session with a coach or whoever else I have helping me. And I realize it's because I'm sort of prepping, and then the stuff that comes out in the session because I have someone, you know, holding space, or just,
Right.
you know, I don't have to kind of think about it, or I don't get distracted by something else that can help me get to that place of realizing kind of what's going on.
Totally. Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah. I'm like with my business coach. It's just kind of like, I don't know why it's not, I don't know what's happening. Yeah, exactly. It's an important thing to let it come out because
Mhm.
when we move away from it, it doesn't help us move past it. The only way is through,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not talking about like re-traumatizing yourself or people, but like there's this balance of going into the emotions and going into the feeling and whatever thoughts are there, not staying there, but going through, finding what information they need to give you so that
Mhm.
you can come out on the other side. Because sometimes we try to skip that and it just keeps coming back and back and back. You
Yeah.
have to go through it. And you
Yeah.
have to go through it in a way that feels safe too. And
Mhm.
everybody might have a different, you know, process for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sarah, let's talk about neuroplasticity and how it can help us heal. Like, what is neuroplasticity first? Hopefully, I'm saying it correctly.
You are, yeah, absolutely. It's so funny. So in the wellness space, this is like I'm gonna do real brief soapbox. I feel like that term gets used maybe in like a marketing salesy way too much,
Yeah.
where everybody's like, yeah, we're gonna rewire your brain and blah blah blah. And it's like, okay. So as a neuroscientist, so I'm always like, let's just walk it back because there is a lot that it can do. But I just want to put that out there. Like I feel like it gets
I agree.
overly salesy at times. So neuroplasticity is just the ability of the brain to change. Really, like that's it. The brain has the ability to change. So it's not set in stone and then that's what you got for the rest of your life, right? We used to think that it was, so that's why it was kind of exciting. So at first we're like, oh yeah, the brain is set, nothing changes, and now it's like, oh no, you can actually grow new neurons, you can change connections. And so I like to think about neuroplasticity in the context of learning. So that's really what's happening is neuroplasticity is the brain is strengthening in the context of learning, it's strengthening connections that are repeated like that are repeated behavior or repeated thought patterns or repeated connections between emotions and thoughts and actions. And so it's a strengthening. The way that happens is often like you've got one neuron that's sending a signal, and then it spits out neurotransmitters onto another one that catch it. And so something happens if this one fires to this one a lot, they learn that, and the neurotransmitters that get caught by the second neuron change gene transcription, which then creates new proteins that go into this place, the synapse, where the receptors are, and it changes the number of receptors that are there. And so what it does is it makes it easier for this neuron to activate this neuron. And so that's what we mean by like strengthening connections, is that this one's fired so many times that it's changed the composition of this one so that it's easier to activate. And so basically what that kind of, the analogy in behavior is like a habit, right? You've just done this over and over again so that it's super easy to fire that off. And so when we're talking about habits or responses to stress, I mean, really things are automatic. We're not going, oh, I think I'm going to shut down my digestion right now because it doesn't make sense because I'm so stressed, right? It's all happening automatically. Or we're not going, I really want to start crying because of some stimulus or something that I'm being exposed to because that's my choice. It just happens automatically.
Yeah.
And that's because we've got strong connections between neurons. And if this has been how our brain has developed, then it's kind of hard to change those. So neuroplasticity is not like a fast panacea for things. But the good news, so I feel like that's a lot of bad news, but the good news is the brain can change, and it can change by adding on new connections and strengthening new connections, where you actually have to go into, say, that emotion and pair it with a new outcome or pair it with a new behavior. And that's not easy, and it really requires a lot of practice, because it's something that has to be repeated. Just like our habits we have habits because we've repeated them over and over again, and that's really the driver of neuroplasticity. So what we do changes our brain, and then our brain also influences what we do. And so it's a reciprocal relationship. It's not a one-way relationship. And so there's a lot on neuroplasticity out there. Like, there's lots of things that can influence, and you don't want to just like increase neuroplasticity. Like you want focused changes to be happening, right? So like if you just increase neuroplasticity, like that's not helpful. Like your brain, you don't want your brain to like grow and make connections, willy-nilly. That's not going to help you. You want a focused new connection. And so I really like the work of Dan Siegel. He talks a lot about how neuroplasticity can be modified by focusing your attention. Like your attention is your tool to lead to the neuroplasticity that you want. So what you focus your attention on is where the neuroplasticity can happen. And so a lot of what I think about is kind of making connections where we're actually getting information from our body that we often kind of get cut off from, and creating new pathways in that way.
I love that, because I think you're right. I think people are like, we're just gonna change the brain or whatever else, and it is kind of, I like that you have the practical advice, but how hopeful is it that we can actually change our habits and our brain? So it's not like, oh, that's just the way I am, and that's just the way my life is. And say, it may take practice, you may need to get help, but what you can change those habits and how you react to things or how we do things or whatever else, that it is possible. Because I think that's so empowering.
It is, and it's so powerful, because things that you didn't think you could change can totally not be something that you're getting stuck in all the time. And often it starts with mindfulness, which for some people is just like, they don't even want to hear that word. So I kind of think about like noticing, being aware of. So the first stage is like just being aware of what is the automatic pattern. Like, what is it that's happening. And in trauma world, we talk about it as like triggers, right? Like something's happening and then you're, oh, I'm triggered. And it's like this automatic response. So it's just noticing what is happening between these two things. And so that's what you want to change, right? That's where the hope is, because this automatic response is usually what's getting us in trouble or causing us pain or emotional pain. And so we want to interrupt that. So, but you can't just like jump in and do that. You need to do it by first noticing it. And as you notice it, what happens is there's a little bit of space that opens up. And this is just with repeated noticing. There's a little bit of space that opens up between when something happens and your reaction, to the point that eventually you can say, well, what would I rather do? Or what would make more sense to do, knowing that this is not a situation from my childhood that's coming up, but rather in this present moment, I'm safe and I don't have to respond this way. So sometimes that requires like having a script ready, or just practicing it in a session with a coach or a therapist or someone. But you can replace things, replace reactions with responses that are coming from a thoughtful place. And that does take practice, because when we're in chronic stress, or when we have like a trauma brain going, we're really driven by what's called our limbic system, or our amygdala, which is like the fear and emotion center, and our prefrontal cortex that kind of brings in the observer witness and be like, oh, okay, kind of like the parent to the toddler who's having a tantrum. That's offline. It's not impacting things. So mindfulness helps us bring that back online, so it can tell the part that's kind of freaking out a little bit that it's okay, and it can make a little bit more space. Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah, because I like to give the people watching something that they can do at home. So how does someone get into that place of sort of calming the nervous system and getting back into their body? What are some ways people can do that at home to sort of get that awareness?
Absolutely. So yeah, because what I'm talking about is kind of like in advance when you're getting at a pattern, but you want to build the skill. It really is just a skill. And so there are ways that start with the body, and I'll just say that sometimes the body can be triggering, right? If you are in pain, or you are having symptoms, like you don't necessarily want to go just like swimming around in your body, right? Like that can be scary.
Sorry to interrupt. When someone's dealing with an autoimmune illness, sometimes your body is your least safe place.
Right.
So that can be tough to be like, oh, my body, for me, bleeds. And so it's like, oh, this does not feel very safe. And I just sometimes you just want to get like, if I could just be in some other body, so getting to that space of, that, which I know work, but just the simple steps to start that habit.
Absolutely. So what I would say is, if your body doesn't feel like a safe space, but we want to tune in to the body though. So what I suggest is finding a place in your body that feels not bad, like that feels okay. And maybe it's your thumb, right? So maybe it's your thumb, maybe it's your left calf muscle. I don't know, mine are usually pretty sore and tight, right? But usually your earlobe, like usually you can find one place. And so you want to direct your attention and tune into your body there, and just ask, what sensation am I noticing? And this is a wonderful thing to journal with, because what happens is we practice tuning into any part of the body. It doesn't have to be the whole body, where if you're like, you don't want to like go, you can eventually, like you can do a body scan, but if that's triggering for you, like that's a meditation you can find on Insight Timer or Headspace, like YouTube, anywhere. But if that's too much, just go to one body part and describe to yourself what you're noticing. And if what you're noticing is nothing, that's still something. Like you can still notice what's happening. You can also just take your hand and you can notice, how does it feel to open and close the hand? That's usually not super triggering for folks, is just to feel what it feels like. Or you can do something like a walking meditation, which is so challenging to do for an extended period of time. But you're noticing your feet the weight of your feet, if your heel is hitting the ground first and then you're moving to the ball of your foot, and how it's crunching the leaves that are out there right now. And so you're noticing what you're feeling, the weight of gravity acting on your body, and then the other sounds or sensations that are coming up. And so it's tuning into the stuff that we ignore all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And just that practice helps you, A, to feel safe going into your body if you're doing it in this way, and B, it is creating or opening up these channels of information that we might not have had previous access to. And it's a slow game. It's something that you would want to practice for, regularly. It's hard to do things daily, right? I'm a big fan of like, do your best, right? But like doing that regularly can help build this relationship with your body so that you can start to get access to some of the wisdom there. And it really is a titration kind of a thing, like just little bits at a time, because you don't want to overwhelm yourself. So if your body is not a safe place and you do a body scan, you're just going to go, no, never. My body is not safe. So focusing on like hands or feet or something that feels safe is good. And if you add journaling about it, writing down with words, that helps. And it's really hard. Like, it's really hard. You can be like, numb. They're numb. I don't feel anything. And like, it's the practice of doing that, because what that does is your right side of your brain is really good at all this sort of nonverbal sensory information and images and all of that. But it helps to integrate to the other side, the left side, where all of our language processing is happening. So if you try to put words onto it, either with your voice or with writing, you're really helping to integrate both hemispheres. And a lot of things that we find as a result of trauma are like disintegration of our hemispheres, or disintegration from this nervous system with the rest of the nervous system that extends to the rest of the body. So going down and feeling that, and then putting language to it, it's so simple, and it seems ridiculous that it's like, oh, and that will help. But over time, that helps you tune into the wisdom that your body has, and it creates new safe ways to experience your body. And that teaches your brain, particularly your amygdala, that is like your fire alarm fear center, like, hey, this is safe. It's okay. This is not killing me. Like, because that's where it goes. Like, your amygdala immediately goes like, I'm dying, right? I'm dying because of this. It's just like, it's the biggest overreactor ever. And so you're just making little headway into that. So tune into the body in whatever place feels safe. You can do your hand moving, a body part that just feels neutral or not in pain, or that feels safe, or a walking meditation. And then describing with language, giving an effort at it. The effort is what matters. That can really help start to get this relationship with the body going again.
And I love that starting slow, because so often we think we just have to do it and we have to go big, and because our society's like that. When you watch the workout exercises and all of that, and I was like, I finally found someone who understands exercising with autoimmune illness, because it's like, I'm not the 20-year-old that, even when I was a 20-year-old, I never had the energy to be like going hard or whatever else. And I never felt like, oh yeah, I could get all that sort of strength and energy. I would just go start and I'd be like, I'm already tired and I'm starting. And so I think starting slow and honoring that and knowing that that's making a difference, and it might just be a little piece, but that slowly it'll be expanded upon. Because I know for me, there's certain times where, I practice tuning in and being like, okay, because I've gotten to the point where I feel safe enough that even if my colon's unhappy, I can sort of go in and be like, okay, so what do you kind of need right now? And all of that, so that I can be like, oh, I need to avoid this food right now because my intuition and my body's telling me that it's not helping me right now. So you can get to a place of your own innate wisdom and using that.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because like your intuition and your innate wisdom, it's like you have a nervous system in and around your gut and your heart. Like, you have, some people call it like multiple brains, but it's like the enteric nervous system. And so all of that is communicating. In fact, we get more communication from our body up than we do from our brain down via particular nerves like the vagus nerve. And so that is where our intuition is coming from. It's so useful for making decisions, and that, like, those gut feelings, right? That is because we have a nervous system that is connecting to our brains, and then we can we translate that into something that we can use. And so, yeah, that is, I love that you brought that up.
So let's talk a little bit about, because I love you, you're a neuroscientist, you know, a former professor now. And so I love science. But I also know that mixing in kind of that ancient wisdom, our innate inner wisdom, how can the combination of science and the ancient wisdom sort of help us heal and feel sort of like in a whole sort of healthy place?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think it's an important question right now, for people who value science and who also value this sort of other side, this ancient was, I mean, a lot of times it's called woo now, right? But like, right, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it's a nice shorthand. But like, a lot of it can be like energy work, like Reiki, or what I have been drawn to is shamanic practices. And so that's indigenous wisdom from cultures, not just so I'm in the United States, but not just the United States, but like in, you know, European traditions in South America. And so what I have found to be the most useful for healing is that it connects us to something bigger, because the worldview or the cosmology of an expanded, like, view of what it is to be human, where we're connected to the earth, we're connected to other living beings or not, it is that we're part of something that is bigger, regardless of whether or not you believe in God or divine source energy, any of that. Like, but when we're part of something bigger, which is what comes with this sort of indigenous wisdom, then it kind of, it lifts us up in a way, because not just that it gives us responsibility, because it does come with a lot of responsibility, but it lifts us up in that we're not alone in this. And there is so much wisdom that has come before us. And so what I've found in my studies over the years is that it's almost comical. So many of the really effective, like, trauma therapy modalities, and a lot of what I use in my coaching, it has origins in indigenous wisdom, or, you know, ancient wisdom, traditional practices, right? Or energy medicine, all of this stuff. Like, there's all of these names for it. And westernized cultures have just, like, taken it and then taken the connection to nature or to spirit or our soul and isolated it. And then we're like, okay, so now here are the methods to do this. And they work really well. I've just found that they work way better if you expand out and acknowledge that you have a soul, that energy is more than just our body and, like, our nervous system, the electrical impulses that we have, that it expands beyond that. And it just, it kind of sinks in better. And the way that I've found to do that, like, the way that I work is pretty integrated. Like, I couldn't tell you in one moment if I'm doing something that is energetic versus psychological, because I've really, like, they are integrated. So it's just kind of an expansion of psychological things that I do. But I have found that the use of imagination, of visualizing, of allowing images to arise from sensation, and then doing something with an intention, where you are sort of like, you are commanding this energy or this space to do something, and you are, like, taking control of yourself and your space and your energy, that has real implications in the world. It's not just imagination. Like, what we think with our minds, our brain actually doesn't know if it's real or not. Right? And so at some level, the scientist in me is like, oh, I have to have evidence, and, like, I have to know that this is real. And so like, and this is where it's going to be hard. I think science will catch up eventually. We just don't have the tools to measure this. I mean, we do have a lot of research that shows that like acupuncture is very useful for a lot of things, right? And so there just needs to be some catch up, I believe, on like getting empirical evidence. But I also think that an individual's experience is so important. And when I was studying neuroscience, a lot of what I was tending towards was individual differences. And that, I feel like that's where this sort of ancient energetic or indigenous wisdom comes in, where it's like your individual experience matters. And so incorporating that into the healing process is key. So yeah, I think the take home is like your imagination is this sort of gateway for healing, that can call in some of these other alternative healing methods, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It does. And I know for me, you know, because like my journey with autoimmune illness is like, oh God, something's going on. You go to the doctor. I was very fortunate. Mine was really easy to diagnose. It was very clear, ulcerative colitis, you know, and then you go on the journey. So I tried medications and it did help. It's not, definitely a place for all of that. And everyone has their own journey. But for me, I noticed when I did all the physical things like eating well, getting the appropriate exercise for my body, getting enough rest, I did well. But if I didn't add in that mind-body connection, for me, I mean, I've tried it all: acupuncture, homeopathy, herbal medicine, whatever else. But that brought me to a place where I can manage my healing, you know, mostly on my own. I still go to my doctor and everything else, but it brought me to a different place of healing, that it was more consistent. I felt much more empowerment because I wasn't placing that on somebody else. It was very much, oh, how am I feeling? And so getting a coach, getting an energy healer, whatever else, I felt that I was able to have more resources for me to heal. And I went to a place of deeper healing because of all of that. But there's still that part of me is like, oh, but the science, and people think maybe we're crazy. But I had to come to that place of I have to honor my own experience.
Yes. I couldn't agree more, right? Yes, we do have to honor our own experiences. And I think as a practitioner, it's scary because like we're taking money for this kind of healing when you're doing it. And so that's why I always integrate it with things that I know are also backed by science. So I don't do it just one or another, but you're so right. I think, my experience has been like, I have been on and off of say antidepressants for the majority of my life. I don't have any problem with antidepressants. I do think that people go to them maybe too quickly, and that's just because of where psychiatry is right now. But I think that there is a time and a place for that. And I think that we need to use all of our tools, all of what we have access to, right? And so westernized medicine is important. It has so much value. And so I think that like, we're not saying either or, we're saying both and, right? That this takes it deeper. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I did, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that really is of this beautiful, and there is a lot more doctors that are talking about stuff like that, of like stress and, you know, obviously they talk about exercise, but I think there's a lot more saying, okay, well, let's look at how is your emotional health doing? And not in the sense of like, it's all in your head, you're just crazy. It's like, well, let's look at your life. And I look forward to the day where those kind of mesh a little bit more, and there is more of that combination. Because I think when it comes to somebody, like, you know, if I would have been diagnosed, you know, now, it would be so much more easy to navigate that journey of combining all of that and sort of getting that message. Because then when I was diagnosed, it was like, oh, diet has nothing to do with it. And I'm like, but this is an illness that deals with my bowel. And the problem is they're correct on science, because they haven't found any specific food that triggers colitis. So the doctors are correct. They're not wrong. It's just that, and I think now more the messaging is like some people will find something different, and it's going to be up to you to discover that. And it maybe isn't the greatest answer. You wish you had a definitive answer, but I think that's where it is. And I love where we can come to a place now of honoring the science and all of that, but our ancestral wisdom, our indigenous wisdom, and you know, what you said, there's something bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree with you. Right. It needs to be this combination. And even in my own healing, like I did years of therapy, and it wasn't until I brought in shamanic healing into my own healing that I made massive progress. I mean, I was making progress, but it took it so much deeper.
Yeah.
And like I was able to make progress so much faster and then be done with therapy. I mean, there's always stuff, right? We get coaches and therapists as needed, but
yeah, and I think that's the thing for me. It's like, well, like, for example, somebody's like, yesterday I had a bit of a headache. It's like, well, I know I got to take my Tylenol right away, but I'm also going to use my mint oil to relax my muscles, and I'm going to do my stretching, and I may take a bit more time to rest or meditate or be like, okay, what's kind of going on? Why am I getting this? So I think the combination of all of that, because I know for myself, if I get a headache and I don't take the Tylenol and the pain meds right away, that it could just be worse, and then I'm in bed for a whole day. But it's the combination of all of those things that I can be like, okay, I can use all of those things to help me get to a place where I'm not getting a headache again the next day, and I can have looser muscles or whatever else.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's such the self-compassionate response. And I feel like that's kind of difficult to do. Like if you're too, like I've ping-ponged from the scientific community, academic community to like the wellness community. And there's a lot of stuff in the wellness community about like, well, you can't take medicine or you can't use Western, like there's this like almost puritanical view where you're like, you can't use anything. And I don't think that that's useful. I feel like you need to find what works for you and not overdo it in either side. Like you can't do only energy medicine and expect this all to work out, and you can't do only like pharmaceuticals and expect it to all work out. Like they're each tools, and I think they really need to be integrated on a personal and individualized level. And I kind of like that the doctors are like, yeah, well, you're gonna have to figure it out for yourself. It's acknowledging the individualized thing. And I do know westernized medicine is moving more towards the sort of individualized medicine, but again, not everybody can afford that to go get their genes tested to see how they metabolize things and you know what they have more or less of, right? So it's really just,
it's a real privilege in the wellness community that don't acknowledge people's economic, where they live or whatever else. And again, that's something I'll be talking more about in the future, like not that acknowledging that everyone has their own different experience, and hopefully we can have more equality within medicine or whatever else. That's a whole different conversation. But just really having that integration even within ourselves of the things you can do at home to kind of be like, okay, what can I do to try and get to this point? And that's why I always ask the people I interview, what can people do at home to help start that process for them?
right. Yeah, so much can be done on your own, and sometimes just a little bit of outside input is enough to get you on the right track, for sure.
So Sara, thank you so much. Tell us where people, how you can help people, where they can find you.
Excellent. Yeah. So my website is sarabtaylor.com, because apparently there's a lot of Sara Taylors in the world. So I have to throw my middle initial in there. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Sara B. Taylor, PhD. And so I'm just kind of more recently showing up on social media. It's a process, right? So what I do now, I sort of do a deep dive for people who I work with women who are high functioning, who are not sort of in crisis. And I sort of define that on my website, but I do sort of this integrative healing of, you know, basically like a healing cycle, because we're never going to get through everything. So like one block, one belief system, one kind of emotion, and work through that together. And that's kind of some deep work. But I also have a nervous system mastery program that kind of comes with a lot of accountability to do some of the stuff that I was talking about, right? This sort of like checking in with the body, building that mind-body connection. It's called interoception. And then building onto that, how you can track your triggers so you kind of can see what's happening and not be a surprise at your life. Right, so that you can respond instead of react. And that builds in like responding to emotions and thoughts with a coming from a nervous system perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's great because I think it's, like I'm a coach and I know my limitations. I help people improve their self-care. I help give them accountability. I help cheer them on. We can do some energy healing or whatever else. But I think when it comes to dealing with that kind of trauma we were talking about, it's important to have somebody who really understands that and can hold the space for that. So that's why I was so excited to interview you, because I think it's important for people to understand it and to recognize it, and that it may not be kind of the big thing that we think it is, but also to find the appropriate people to help them educate about it and appropriate people to help them with it.
absolutely. Yeah. And for some people that's therapy, and for some people it can be coaching, and a lot of people it might be a combination of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about your work, because you have that knowledge and experience in the science and, the academia of it all, but also the shamanic, that I think that I talked about the combination of the two is so powerful,
I agree. And it's so fun.
It's so fun. I love when you're talking about all the neuroscience. I'm like, ooh, neat.
I love it. I love it all. It's such a privilege to be able to do this work. That's for sure.
Well, Sara Taylor, thank you so much. I so appreciate you coming to talk with us today. And I just encourage everyone to check you out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyla. It was an honor.